is the same thing as saying that it's the same level of explanation of saying that you know, the human body operates because you breathe air. Okay? Greed is going to be there across the different areas. Okay? The question is, why did greed manifest itself in the particular way that it did? Okay? So I said I was going to say about the why some nations are rich and other nations are poor. Historically, in economics, one of the answers about why some nations are rich and other nations are poor was by David Ricardo, who emphasized the non-human elements in the equation. Why is it that some nations are rich and other nations are poor? It's because there are some nations who have abundance of natural resources and they have advanced technologies. And so what determines the growth and wealth of a nation is its long-run technological possibilities and resource availability. Okay? But the problem with that is that it can't explain certain countries, for example, Hong Kong, right? And it can't explain other countries, such as Russia, which was abundant in natural resources and had, you know, physicists playing chess on every corner, right? But somehow they ate stones for soup. Right? And whereas you have Hong Kong or whatever, and you know, people are street traders and things like that, and yet it develops into a very wealthy country. So how is this possible? So you divide a country up into people, resources, and rules. The rules which govern the interaction of people and their interaction with resources. And what you look at is, see, what are the rules of the game which enable people to realize gains from trade and create wealth? And what we find is that the systems that minimize the predatory influence of the government, all right, and minimize the predatory abilities of private citizens to predate on other private citizens by protecting your private property so you can't hit them over the head to do that. So it's about private property contract. And we basically find out the same thing that David Hume argued, you know, in the 17th century, that it's about stability of possession, transference by consent, and the keeping of promises. And if you find a system of rules that in fact embody that, those countries that approximate that kind of environment, they're the ones that are wealthy. And the ones that have insecure property rights, the ones that have transference by violence, takings, rather than in exchange, so takings, and those who don't keep their promises, those are societies that actually end up in the economic basket case. So that's the first, that's the first thing. Now think about that in terms of those rules. So example, I'm actually somewhat intimidated here because I have, also another person in the audience who's one of the great sort of tremendous foot soldiers for the cause of liberty. And so I don't want to misspeak here in front of Joe Kwong, who I think is done tremendous work over at Atlas, but before that at the Institute for Humane Studies as well. And so how is it that we make the best arguments for liberty? But Joe and I also share another thing, which is that we've spent an awful lot of time in gyms. And so we've seen a lot of basketball games over the years. And one of the things I wanted to say is when I teach my students all the time, even if they don't like basketball or not, I always use these basketball analogies because they're the things in my head. So I always try to tell the students to explain this relationship between the universal logic of economics and then the contextual implications of economics. I use the idea of homo basketballicus. Right? Man in the generic sense, because Joe's example is watching the females play, and so. But anyway, so the idea here is homo basketballicus. Man as a basketball player wants to score more points than their opponent at the minimum amount of effort that they can do. Everyone recognize that? I also use the example of homo studenomicus. Right? Students want to get the best grade for the minimal amount of effort that they can ever put in. No student ever says, oh, give me a C and I'll work really hard in your class. Right? They all want to get an A and have absolutely nothing to do in your class. And then they'd be really happy. That's basically homo studenomicus. Well, homo basketballicus, right, is going to try to score the points, minimizing their effort going into it. The way in which the basketball game is played is going to change as the rules of the game change. So for those of you who are old enough to remember this, Basketball didn't used to have a three-point line. And when it didn't have a three-point line, the game was played differently than it does now. Right? Every single coach that you ever had would tell you a 20-foot shot you give up for an 18-foot shot, and an 18-foot shot you give up for a 16-foot shot. And you try to bang the ball into the big guys. And if you look at the history of the NBA, this was the era in which all the big guys dominated. All right? Because they always had to have a very strong post presence to be an effective basketball team, because you needed to have a guy, and basketball is dominated by that. Okay? International basketball was so annoyed by this in playing against the Americans that they did this funky little foul line that you've all seen in the international play, where the bottom, which is close to the basket, is farther out, and it gets narrowed by the foul line. Okay? I'm an economist, by the way, because I developed a hatred for the Soviet Union, which was born in 1972 when they were robbed, the Americans, of the gold medal for the first time, and I switched all my alliances from baseball to basketball because I got all freaked out about the United States team losing. And so you would have asked me when I was 18, what do I think of the Soviet Union? I would have said, I hate it. And you would have said, well, have you ever read Mises or, you know, Ayn Rand or anyone else who hated collectivism? It's like, no. They ripped off Doug Collins. He made those free throws, you know, right? But then I read Mises and I was like, that's why, you know. But anyway, so homo basketballicus, right? You're gonna change the rules of the game. You're gonna have an impact on the way the players play the game. So now, thinking about the current crisis, all right? There are very important economic concepts that are necessary for you to think about. One of them is the moral hazard idea. A moral hazard is when I privatize the profits but socialize the losses, people are going to behave in a different way than if I privatize the profits and privatize the losses. One of the things in the Waxman and Davis hearings today that they were talking about was why exactly is it that the CEOs made such risky gambles, which is what they did do. They were making very risky gambles. Well, because the incentives were for them to do so. And they thought that they had found financial instruments, to diversify the risk. One of which was having the ability to not have the mortgages tied locally. Historically, mortgages were held by George Bailey, right? And you would have a one-to-one relationship. When my parents, your grandparents, some of you, your parents, when they went to buy a house, they had to put 20% down, and they could only pay, 1/4 of their monthly salary for their mortgage. That was what they had to do. And if they couldn't do that, they couldn't qualify to get a house. All right? And that was a very, strict thing to put on there. But what I believe is that I'm going to be able to diversify my portfolio of mortgages. I'm at a bank and I can sell it. And so therefore, it's no longer the banker in that community or in that region. Some housing prices are going to go up, some are going to go down. So what they believe they could do is diversify the risk by spreading their mortgage portfolio across the whole United States without the idea that it would all fall at once or something like that, right? So again, you can understand, just like you can understand at the end of the basketball game in the 19-whatever series when the Knicks were playing the Houston Rockets, and Pat Riley decided not to get the ball to Patrick Ewing, but instead kept on having John Starks try to shoot three-pointers. Right? At one point you think, God, that strategy is not working for you. Why are you doing that? But the way the point spread was at the time, each decision at that node was in fact a rational choice to do. But the unintended, undesirable consequence was that the Knicks couldn't beat the Houston Rockets that year, and they ended up by losing their chance to win a championship. All right? But the strategy was not a stupid strategy at that particular time. It just didn't work out. Similarly, when the CEOs are deciding their portfolio and they're told that they can privatize their profits but socialize their risks, it makes very much sense for them to be very risky or imprudent. Just like it makes sense for people in New Orleans to live at the bottom of a soup bowl. Right? If someone tells you, hey, I'm going to give you a bunch of money, live at the bottom of the soup bowl. Right? You say, okay, here, thank you. And then when the soup overcomes, you go, like this. right? And, you know, so normally most of us wouldn't want to live at the bottom of a soup bowl. In fact, historically, when the Indians settled